Good morning. Before you get too settled in, I'd like to invite anybody in the back to come forward a little bit. It's always easier for the speaker to talk to somebody who's close rather than a football field away. Thank you. And thanks for staying for our Saturday morning speaker series brought to you by St. Joseph Radio and SJEN TV. This morning, our speaker is Father Jim Mitulski, and many of you recognize him because he's the just recently retired pastor of St. Norbert's Catholic Church, just north of us. He was pastor for 16 years, so he's a familiar face around here. And this morning, he's going to speak to us about St. Francis of Assisi. Father Jim?
Thank you. Let's start with a prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. So today I'm going to talk a bit about St. Francis of Assisi. And he's always been a favorite saint of mine. Even in high school, I really appreciated and loved St. Francis of Assisi. So I can't really tell you all the places where I found out about him because it's been over a period of 65 years, I don't know, something like that, that my information about St. Francis grew. So what I did, though, was when I heard I was going to give this talk, I wanted to bone up a little bit on St. Francis, and I found this lecture series by Brother William Shart, who is a professor at the Franciscan School of Theology, and it was titled, A New Way of Being Christian, St. Francis of Assisi. And it is packed full of information, a lot of information that I never knew. So I just wanted to give him credit for some of the things I will say that probably come right out of his mouth, okay? I don't want to take credit for anything that isn't mine, so. Anyway, St. Francis. First of all, Francis lived from 1181 or 2, he was born in one of those 2 years, to 1226. And he grew up in the town of Assisi. Now, it was a very chaotic time, and I think it would not be well not to mention some of the things going on in Assisi when Francis was growing up, because it really, I think, helped form the kind of person he was. First of all, there were 2 different factions of leadership in many of these Italian towns. One was the church, and the other was the nobility. Sometimes the nobility was connected to the emperor, sometimes the nobility was connected to the church. And basically, for 800 years, there had been no roads between towns. The roads had deteriorated after the fall of the Roman Empire, and they didn't begin to start again to rebuild until the Crusades, which began to take place in the time of St. Francis. So all these regions, these towns, were kind of isolated from one another. And basically, the town consisted of a noble's land. So the noble had the land, and all the people there in that town worked on the land. Sometimes the land was owned by the church, sometimes the land was owned by a family. And this kind of, I would say, helped people or allowed people to see their faith in a certain way, because the only paradigm they had to borrow from was where they were living. So you had a noble person who ran the land, and then everybody was under that person. So for the most part, the spirituality of the time had to do with this: Jesus, the great judge of heaven and earth. And basically, if you look at all the artwork of that time, for the most part, Jesus was seen kind of stern. And he was there at judgment to judge the living and the dead. And that was kind of the spirituality of the time, until a guy named Bernard of Clairvaux came along. He was a Cistercian, and he began to develop more of a theology of compassion and humanness. He began to have sermons that reflected the Blessed Mother and her relationship with Jesus. And it began to kind of transform the insights of people into spirituality. There were other things that transformed that insight too. Like I said, there were the noble, and I'm going to get into that right now. There were the nobles and there were the clergy. But then, right around the time of Francis, came another group called the merchants. Francis's father was a merchant. Neither the nobles nor the church liked the merchants. The merchants were considered kind of outlaws because all the wealth was in the land. Now the merchants began to trade. And when they traded, they made their living by creating a profit for the services they were rendering to others. And the church and the nobility considered this profit as sort of usury. So they considered it immoral. So now you had these three factions in these towns. There was no money. All wealth was in the land. But with the merchants, there became bartering, more and more bartering. But as time went on, the merchants also began to travel with the Crusades, because they saw in this travel a great opportunity to buy, for instance, cloth in Damascus and places like that, bring the cloth back and sell it. They would bring it back on the ships, carrying people to and from the Crusades. So now they needed money, because you couldn't take a sack of potatoes and turnips with you to do this bartering, right? So even though money had not been used as a way of transferring wealth for some time, there was coinage, and they began to use this coinage either stamped with the emperor or stamped with the Pope. All this gold coinage was valuable in terms of currency. It was recognized. And so currency began to once again become a popular thing. Now, in the time of Assisi, these merchants also learned how to read. So they began to read the scriptures. And as they began to read the scriptures, they began to build on what Bernard of Clairvaux talked about in terms of the humanity, the human side of Jesus, about the love between the Blessed Mother and Jesus. But also, as they began to read the scriptures, they began to see in the Acts of the Apostles and in the words of Jesus, go out to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them all that I have commanded you. So now there is beginning to be a new type of sense of among the laity that their mission is to bring the gospel to others. So you have a complete change in the structure of the society. When Francis was a young boy, the Rocca, which was the governing place in Assisi, was just completely overrun by the merchants, who then began to take over the town and created mayors and a government system that was more friendly toward the merchants. The nobility had to flee to Perugia, which was across the river, where they felt safe from the merchants. Francis's family was probably in that great rebellion against the Rocca. Some people think Francis was involved in it, but I think Francis was probably too young at the time. He's probably about 10 when that happened. He could have been there, but who knows? But anyway, so what happens in Perugia is this. Eventually, when Francis is about 19, 20 years old, the nobles in Perugia declare war on Assisi, and Francis goes over to Perugia to fight, and he's taken prisoner, and he's in prison for about a year in Perugia. And as he's there, there begin to become stories about Francis and his jokester mentality, and apparently he was always known to be a jokester, and he actually ran a club or some kind of organization in Assisi. It was a drinking club, and also they created a lot of practical jokes all over town. So I mention that because that's going to come into play over and over again in Francis's life, as people don't trust what he's doing because they think he's joking with them. They're not sure how sincere he is. So that gives you kind of a background, kind of a chaotic time, huh? So that's the background which Francis grows up in. Now, Francis, being a merchant, they were still not considered part of the ruling class or the upper class of people, like the nobles were, but they had a chance to get noble. And this is how they would do it. If a son of one of these merchant families, and Francis, by the way, could read and write a bit in Latin. He was educated at his parish church, and he knew French. French was the language of the nobility. It was considered high-class language. So he knew a bit of French. He was enamored with the idea of becoming a knight. And there was a fourth crusade that is organized. And it was basically to take back a lot of the lands that were stolen from the church. And Francis and his family see in this particular moment an opportunity to jump into a new class of people. Because if you were a knight, you could marry into the nobility and become part of the nobility. So this is a kind of an exciting thing. And they say when Francis went away to this battle, this crusade, he was really dressed to the nines. He had on the best armor. He had a beautiful horse. And his family has got, so not only is Francis seeing his dream being fulfilled, but at the same time he's seeing his dream being fulfilled, he's also, his family is seeing their dream being fulfilled. So it carries with him a great hope for his whole family as he rides off to this crusade. Now, the first night that he's away, he has a dream. Now, we don't hear this from Francis himself. We hear this from the historians who wrote about Francis. These are not Francis's words. But in this dream, he sees himself in a great hall. And the hall is filled with banners, flags, with red crusade emblems on them. It's the cross in red on all these emblems. And he has a sense, and this is either a dream or a vision, we're not sure. He has a sense that, finally, this is my dream being fulfilled. This is my way to nobility. And then he hears a voice, and the voice says, Francis, is it better to follow the master or to follow that person that works for the master? And he says, well, Lord, it's better to follow the master. And then he's told to follow him, to follow Jesus. So he leaves that very next morning to go back home. So he's not even gotten to the crusade yet. And he leaves to go back home. And there he is, riding back into town. This completely destroys everything. For his family dream, it's gone. For him, it's gone. You think anyone else would sponsor him as a knight who didn't even get the battle but returned home? It's gone. It's all gone. So his father's disappointed. His family's disappointed. He is discombobulated. He doesn't know what's going on. And then he gets up the following morning, takes some cloth from his father's shop and a horse, and goes to the town next to Assisi and sells it all. He takes the coinage back to a little church, San Damiano. He doesn't go back home. He goes to San Damiano. And while he's there, there's a priest there. The church is completely run down. It's right at the foot of Assisi. And he asks the priest to take him in. He offers the priest the money. And he says, take me in. Now, basically what he's doing is, if you think about the mentality of the time, he's saying, I want to be under the auspices of the church. And that's where we're going to leave it right now, because the priest didn't make a decision. But the next day, Francis's father catches wind of this. He is furious. He goes to San Damiano. He demands the money. The priest hasn't accepted the money yet because he thinks Francis might be playing one of his practical jokes. So he doesn't trust Francis. He doesn't take the money. And the priest gives the money back to the father, but there's a dispute about it. Francis is arrested by his father, legally at the time that could be done, and he's in prison in his house. But somehow, even though the priest offered the money back to Francis's father, the money's not there yet. I don't know where the money is at the moment, okay? And it's kind of a mystery as to where the money was at the moment. But Francis is now in jail in his house, and Francis's father leaves on a business trip, and Francis's mother lets him go. Well, this does not bode well with Dad. So now Francis's dad comes back, and he says, hey, goes to that priest, and he says, I want this money. Francis said, okay, let's go to court, but I want not the court of the town, but the court of the church. I want Bishop Guido, who's the bishop of Assisi, to lead this court. So they meet at the cathedral, the courtyard. The whole town is there, watching what's going to go on. And the father presents his case that the money, Francis did not have any right to take this money. And the bishop agrees with him. And I would agree with him too. I was trying to think about what would be going through Francis's mind. And I look back on when I was a kid, maybe 18 years old or so, still living at home, 17, I don't know, still living at home. And I think probably I thought that everything that belonged to Mom and Dad belonged to me. I don't know, that's how I think I thought back then. So maybe Francis thought he had a right to do that. I'm just offering a little editorial there. But I'm not sure. But Francis agrees with his dad, okay. And the bishop says, we cannot take this money, the church cannot take this money because it's ill-gotten money. So Francis gives the money back to his dad, and as they're standing there in the courtyard, he begins to remove articles of clothing and places them in his dad's arms until he's completely naked in the courtyard. And he says, now I've given back to you everything that I had from you, and now I have but one Father, my Father in heaven. And it breaks the dad's heart. He is completely humiliated by this experience. And this is the last time in Francis's history that we have any recollection of his father coming into the picture. Immediately, the bishop tries to find something to cover Francis. And this is kind of symbolic. There's a lot of different stories. One is he takes his cloak and wraps around him. The other is he says to this guy over here, hey, give him your cloak, okay? So then there's another one where he sends somebody into the house to get something put on Francis. But at any rate, what's going on here is the bishop is taking over the care of Francis. Francis is becoming part of the church. That's what's happening at this moment. So, Francis, when this happens, he finds an old shepherd's cloak, like a real raw, uncomfortable, poor person's tunic, puts it on, puts a belt around him, and shoes and a staff. And he begins to rebuild the church of San Damiano. He goes to town begging for stones. There's no stones. Everything's fallen apart. So he goes to town begging for stones. And as he's doing this, the priest that is at San Damiano begins to be concerned about him and starts cooking his meals. Well, Francis doesn't want that. He says, it's not right that you should cook my meals. So then he starts begging for food. So now he's begging for stones, and he's begging for food. And there's one really touching story at this time where Francis goes begging for oil to keep the light in front of the crucifix lit. Let me back up just a little bit. Francis has had a vision of Jesus talking to him from the crucifix, and Jesus says to him, rebuild my church. You can see it's falling apart. So Francis sees in this that he's supposed to rebuild this church. He doesn't understand. Jesus is saying, rebuild my church, the whole church. So in one story, Francis goes into town and he knocks on this door. He's looking for oil for the lamp to keep lit in front of the church. In front of the crucifix. And he knocks on the door, and all of his friends are there in that house, all of his drinking buddies. And there he stands in front of them, dressed like a beggar, with this old rough tunic on and with a cross on it. And he just looks at them, and they look at him, and he turns and walks away. But then, because he's embarrassed, but then all of a sudden he turns around, comes back, he knocks on the door again, and he starts speaking in French. French is the noble language. And what Francis was doing was he was raising the concept of begging from something shameful to something glorious for God. He was doing God's work. So I want to mention, too, when he came back from the crusade that he never went to, he developed a strong devotion to St. Michael the Archangel. And I think this fits in here. So the thing about St. Michael the Archangel, that prayer was created by the Pope for the battles of the Crusades. I think Francis took that prayer and repurposed it for the battle against evil and the battle of Christ to win the world. So when I see Francis, when I read this section of Francis speaking in French to his friends, raising the bar of this begging to something noble, I think that all fits together. His friends actually gave him something, gave him money. Now, this is the beginning of the conversion of Francis, huh? I'm going to turn a couple pages here. I must say, Francis he was terrified like most people of leprosy. Let me tell you what they would do about leprosy at Francis's time. When a new mayor was elected in Assisi, he, the mayor, a couple of acolytes from the church, a medical person, whoever that might be, somebody that bled people, somebody that did all kinds of crazy things. At the time, there was no real medical people. They would go from house to house in Assisi, and they would look at all the people on their tax rolls in that house. They would examine them for any white patches on their skin. This was a sign of leprosy. If they found them, they took them out of the house immediately. They went to the cemetery located outside of the hospital where the lepers were kept. They declared the person dead. They put a black funeral pall on them and sprinkled dirt on their head as if they were in a grave. And then they took them to the hospital, never to leave. So everybody was afraid of leprosy, including Francis. So I want to read to you what he says about the next part of his conversion. The Lord led me, Brother Francis, to begin to do penance in this way. When I was in sin, it seemed extremely bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them. And I practiced mercy with them. And after a while, that which seemed bitter to me was changed into sweetness of body and soul. I hesitated for a short time, and then I left the world. What's he saying there? It's just a beautiful thing he's saying. You know, Jesus says in the gospel, he says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And he's trying to always tell people that the world is more than what we see with our eyes, like this hard surface here, or these lights in this room, or even the beautiful windows here. The world is more than that. There is a spiritual dynamic running through the whole world. And what Jesus' gospel was meant to be was that way to awaken us to this greater reality of everything that is the kingdom of God. And Francis accessed it. I think that's what he's saying. I left the world. He was in a new world. So that was one step in Francis's conversion. So here's the next step. Francis is at the church right outside where the lepers hospital is. And while listening to the priest during Mass, he heard the gospel, which was in Latin, which Francis knew, but not as well as the priest probably knew it. But he didn't understand the message the gospel was conveying. It was the gospel where Jesus gave these instructions to his apostles. Take nothing with you for your journey, neither coin or purse or walking staff. Francis felt these words were meant for him, but he didn't quite understand them, so he asked the priest what they meant. When the priest explained the meaning to Francis, Francis cried out, "This is what I want. This is what I desire. This is what I long for in my heart." He takes off the belt that ties the cord around himself. He lets go of the walking stick and the shoes. He clothes himself with the garb of a peasant laborer at the time, a plain tunic with a hood. He wraps the cord around his waist, and with bare feet he walks away. So he listened to what the gospel said, and he followed it completely, okay? So, another step of conversion. Now, there was a fellow in Assisi who knew Francis well. Bernard was his name, Bernardo. And he knew Francis over the years, and he was a very, very wealthy person. And when Bernardo observed Francis, the changes in Francis and his begging and the like, he became very interested in Francis, and he invites him to his house to dine. And then he says, "Why don't you spend the night?" Well, Bernardo's kind of suspicious of Francis. So as Francis is spending the night, Bernardo kind of keeps an eye on him. And you notice Francis is up all night praying. And he hears words like, "My Lord, my God, and my all." And he begins to take Francis seriously. Because once again, Bernardo was thinking this was all part of a great elaborate hoax that Francis was pulling on everybody because of his practical jokerness. But by the next morning, Bernardo was convinced that Francis was serious. Now, what does he do? He asks Francis if he can join him. So Bernardo joins him, and then another guy, Pietro of Catania, joins him. He was the notary in the town, so now you have this son of a merchant, the son of a nobility, and this very educated person who practiced law, all following Francis and asking him for his guidance. This was not what Francis thought was going to happen. You know, this was a complete surprise to Francis. Francis was not trying to start a whole new community, but this is what was happening. So he writes at this time, "The Lord gave me brothers." So he wanted to know from the Lord what he should be doing. So he and his companions go to church, and they open the book of the Gospels. They pray that God would give them some guidance for them in the opening of the book. The first place that they open the book to is Matthew. And the scripture quote is, "If anyone wishes to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and then come and follow me." And they opened the book a second time, and it was Matthew 16:24. "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." The third time it opened to Luke 14:26. "If anyone wishes to come after me and does not hate father, mother, brother, or sister in his very life, cannot be my disciple." These are the texts on which Francis's ardor is formed. Right after opening these passages in the gospel, Bernardo has a huge garage sale. Of course, they don't have garages back then, I just use that word. He sells everything in his house. I mean, this is a very wealthy man. He sells everything. And then he takes all that money and he has it in his garb that he's wearing, like Francis's, and Francis has the rest of his money in his garb, and they go downtown Assisi and start giving all the money away to the poor. Now, there was in that town at that time, by the cathedral where they were doing all this, there was an old crotchety priest named Sylvester. And Sylvester was mad because he had given donations to Francis for stones to rebuild his church. So he demands the money back for the stones that he contributed. They give him his money back. And as they walk away, Sylvester begins to think about these young men, and he begins to remember how it was for him when he first accepted the vocation of priesthood. And his heart melts, and he becomes Francis's disciple also. So Francis is getting to have somewhat of a following. By about 1209, the number grew to 12. And Francis wanted approval for his way of life. But he doesn't turn to Bishop Guido in Assisi, he goes to the Pope in Rome, Pope Innocent III. Pope Innocent III was probably the most influential pope of the Middle Ages. And in 1209, he sees Innocents. And can you imagine this group of rather shabby people walking into this glorious palace of the Vatican with all these fancily dressed cardinals and courtiers and all that? And here comes this little shabby group, and they ask the Pope to let them do what they do, to follow Jesus in this very simple way. Now remember, the only orders that were people like the Dominicans, the Cistercians, the Benedictines, and they were all modeled on that old concept of stability, stay in town. It was like a very enclosed kind of thing. Now, and if you were in one of those groups, you pretty much stayed in your abbey or monastery, whatever. But Francis wanted this whole new way. He wanted to go out to the people and preach the gospel, minister to them. Innocence gives him permission. And he says, he gives some stipulations, though. He says, show reverence to the clergy and the sacraments. They were not to preach without the permission of the local bishops, and they were not permitted to preach on matters of doctrine. They were to encourage people to live a better Christian life. So, they leave, and Francis is on his way. And as he's on his way back to Assisi, there's this interesting thing that happens. He sees a great bunch of birds in a field. You know, this fellow, Brother Short, who did this 10-point series, he says, this is where the bird bath story started, okay? So he sees this great big field full of birds, and he walks out to them, and much to his surprise, they don't fly away. And much to the surprise of the other friars that are with him, they don't fly away. So then he begins to talk to them, and it looks like they're listening to him. So he takes the gospel where Jesus talks about looking at the birds of the field, they neither toil or do anything, and God takes care of them. He makes that into like a little homily for the birds. And they seem to be listening to him, and then they go on. And this was the beginning of Francis's another level of conversion, where Francis begins to see all creatures, even inanimate ones, even rocks, even brother sun, sister moon. He sees all creatures as sharing the same Father he does, God. Remember, he said, I only have one Father now, God in heaven. That's the Son's God, creator also. That's the bird's creator also. That's the rock's creator also. We are one in God. In other words, Francis is saying we're all one family in God. It's kind of a whole new way of looking at creation, something that probably didn't happen since Genesis, where God says, you take care of creation. Francis is once again, that is reawakening in Francis, this idea of taking care of creation. So this is another level of conversion in Francis's life. He begins to call every creature his brother and sister. Now, I have been talking for 40 minutes. This is the section on St. Clare. Very important, very special, very beautiful. Not because I wrote it, but because of what's in it. But I'm going to skip it because we'll never get out of here otherwise. I have to move on, okay? So I would encourage you to really look at the life of Clare. It's very beautiful. I will say a couple different, tiny tidbits. One is when she's converted, and when she leaves and forms her order, immediately Agnes, the daughter of the king of Bohemia, Agnes of Prague, starts another order in Prague based on Clare's order. Immediately. This is how fast the word of Francis is getting around. It's just amazing. It's just amazing. So that was about 1230 that happened. Now, Francis's ardor is growing by leaps and bounds. And as it's growing, they're getting all kinds of people. So that, you had people that were very poor and simple. Like, for instance, there's one guy named Sylvester, and he thought he was very simple, and he thought this was not the monks, the priests of us, this was another guy. He thought the way of getting close to God was to follow the example of Francis. Completely. So if Francis was walking down the street and spit, Sylvester would spit. If Francis coughed, Sylvester would cough. Okay, so very simple man. Then you had somebody like St. Anthony of Padua coming in. A scripture scholar, a dynamic preacher. He saw 5 Franciscans' bodies coming back from trying to convert the Muslims, beheaded, just bodies without heads. And he was so touched by the dedication of these missionaries, these Franciscan missionaries, he wanted to be one of them. And he joins Francis in his work. So you have Sylvester spitting and coughing, sitting next to Anthony, the doctor, the theologian of the church. Can you imagine how challenging this was for all these people to be together? And so now there's a new pope called Pope Honorius, and he is wanting to move Francis toward a codifying of his order. So it can be, don't pay any attention to those bells. So it can be, it can be an actual order in the church, okay? Recognized an official order in the church, but they have so many rules, and so every time they would get together, they'd rewrite something, and the canon lawyer said, you can't do this, it's too complicated, it's too complex. You got to make it simple, So just to give you an example of how many people there are now in Francis's order, he has a big meeting back in Assisi. It's called the Chapter of the Mats. Over 2,000 Franciscans come. 2,000. And there's nowhere to, it's called the Chapter of the Mats because they would use these reeds and stuff and build little huts to stay in during this chapter. And it only got bigger and bigger and bigger after that. And they were trying to figure out how to codify the rules. And this is where Francis really begins to have trouble because he doesn't want to, he's not into all this regulation. He's more of a free spirit. And eventually, he kind of like backs out of the leadership role and has other people take that over. And I'm looking for this little quote of Francis. That chapter, by the way, was in 1221. So this brother, as Francis backs out of the leadership role, this brother challenges him. And he says, why did you abandon your position? And Francis replies, the Lord did not call me to be a policeman. My office to the brothers is spiritual. If they do not follow my example, I don't want to force them by punishments. Because basically all these orders had like little jail cells where they would put the bad monks who wouldn't pay attention. I don't know for how long or whatever, but it was something that they did back in the Middle Ages. So then Francis goes on this retreat and he kind of lets those guys take over that position, and he tries to kind of be refreshed. And he's in a retreat, and he has this idea. He's talking to this fellow named Francis. He's talking to this man. He's in Greccio, Italy, and I don't know if that's where the name came from, but did you ever hear of Christmas Grecias, huh? Well, he's in Greccio, Italy, and he talks to his buddy, and he says, Giovanni, I want you to find me a mule and an ox and an ass and a little cave. And he takes all those things and makes a nativity scene for Christmas, which is right around the corner. And then he invites the town people to this cave where there's the ass, the ox, and he sets up an altar. And under the altar is the manger for Jesus, but there's no Jesus in the manger. But there's the consecrated host above the manger. So Francis is teaching everybody about how Jesus comes to us now, how he's born every day, every time we have Mass, he's born again, and he's available to us. So it was a very, very joyful moment, and people just really loved it. And it was the beginning of something very special for Francis. And then in 1224, Francis' health becomes more impaired. He begins to have all kinds of terrible problems. Like, one of the things that happens shortly before he dies is he's got all kinds of things, but his eyes were just horrible. The pain in his eyes were so bad that he could not deal with any light. He goes back, he's on his way to see this physician, and he goes back to, on his way there, he has to stop at San Damiano, where Clare of Assisi now has set up a convent. And they set up a little place for him to rest. He's there for 50 days. He can't move because of the pain is so bad. He's in a room that was completely, there was no windows showing. Nothing, no sunlight could come in because the pain was so bad. And doctors came to, well, finally he goes, there's mice running all over the room. It was just terrible. So anyway, he goes on to this physician, and here's how they try to treat this. He's got this moisture in his eyes, and the doctors say the only way we can figure out how to get moisture out of your eyes is through heat. So they heat up these iron bars in a fire, and then they put them on his forehead. and he didn't complain. So that didn't work. Much to everybody's surprise, right? Why wouldn't putting a hot iron fire on your forehead not make you feel better? So he goes on, and he goes to another doctor, and the other doctor didn't have any success either, but he says to the other doctor, what does this mean? And the other doctor says, well, honestly, you don't have long to live. So now he wants to go back to Assisi. Okay. He wants to spend his last days in Assisi. So he's on his way back, and there's all kinds of stories about how people would tear little pieces of his clothes off, little, not like ripping his clothes off like you see in these crazy people doing for their pop stars. No, just tearing a little piece off because they wanted relics. They thought that Francis was already a saint. They wanted a part of him. Now there's another thing going on though. The people of Assisi are petrified that he's not going to get back to Assisi. That's their saint. Nobody's going to steal their saint. And they send knights out to escort him back, to protect him. And it's kind of a funny story. So the knights are out of the territory of Assisi, and they try to buy food for the night, and nobody will sell them anything because they're from Assisi. So they come back and complain to Francis, and Francis laughs and he says, well, that's because you tried to use flies. Flies is what Francis would call money. You tried to use flies. So what you got to do is you got to be humble. You got to go back there and with humility say, for the love of God, would you give me some food? They came back with more food than they could eat. So it worked. So finally they get to Assisi, but they stop at the bishop's house. And the bishop puts Francis up in a place in his residence. Francis wants music, calls his brothers in. He says, play music for me. Sing the canticle of the sun to me. By the way, remember I told you about that terrible place where Francis was at San Damiano, where he was in this room that was so painful? That's where he created the canticle of the sun. In all that misery, you can see his heart was still full of joy. Just amazing. So he goes back, and he's got all these guys in the room with him. They're singing, they're playing. The people of Assisi come and stand at the window and watch this. They start complaining. This is not how a saint's supposed to die. Singing, music, song.